Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on tiering healthcare professionals. My name is Eric Bolesh. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Cutting Edge Information. First, a little bit about the voices you'll be hearing today. That's me up top, and I'm joined by Jacob Presson for today's session. We've both been here for a number of years, and we've spent our time developing data that delivers real-world findings to our clients, which is what we'll be doing with you all today. But first, I have some housekeeping to get out of the way, and then we'll jump right into the findings. These points up here primarily focused on how you can interact with us. You'll see that the first 2 points are about audio. If you're having any issues whatsoever, please reach out to us and we can help you. The rest of the points center around question submission. If you do have any questions, please use the Q&A pane and we will address as many of them as we possibly can. Okay, let's talk about tiering. Cutting Edge Information is focused on fair market value rates for HCP compensation. And that means that we are constantly discussing issues of tiering with our clients. We see a lot of different approaches, and we know that organizations are often trying to improve what they do. They're curious about how other organizations handle things, whether certain approaches are industry standard or not. And today, we'll walk through some key elements of what we've seen in the field. What are the main methodologies? What kinds of interesting trends are emerging? What do companies do about exceptions and building exceptions processes? Now, right off the bat, we have all this data because we've been working on FMV rates for more than 10 years now. We were founded in 2002, and we've been developing real-world findings in all the intervening years. We are now currently specialized in collecting and analyzing global FMV data. The way we get all of that information is through an annual data gathering and development process. So each year for the last 5 years, we've run a global data collection effort to build a database of true FMV rates. We use a survey, of course, and we also collect actual rate cards from companies. So to date, we've collected rate cards from more than 80 different organizations across pharma, biotech, and medical devices. And those rate cards, as well as the survey, provide us with all kinds of information about how companies are approaching tiering and exceptions. On top of that, we're talking with clients as they deploy their FMV programs into different markets and different specialty areas. So all of that work taken together exposes us to these connected areas of compliance and HCP relationship management. We've been speaking on these topics over the past year. We covered travel policies back in March. We've also looked at the anatomy of rate cards. And today, of course, we're covering tiering and exceptions. So let's get into the first of our topics, the factors that play a role in HCP tiering. In short, what are people thinking about when they develop their methodologies? What criteria do they consider? How do they weight those different criteria? What are the different things that come into these processes? But before we get into that, we want to hear from you. So here's the first of our poll questions. In a nutshell, we're asking, how does your organization approach tiering? Do you use an entirely internal process? Do you look to a third party? Or is it more of a hybrid where you have an internal group using a tool developed by a third party? So let's take a moment and we'll look at these responses, and then I'm going to hand the mic over to Jacob, who will walk us through the findings.
You can kick things off, Jacob, by taking a look at these answers. Do you see anything interesting in the poll responses there?
Sure. So one of the things that definitely stood out to me is that we do see a lot of companies relying on third parties in some way, shape, or form. So we saw that a little over 20% will use some kind of third-party tool. We also see a slightly smaller number actually outsourcing the process entirely. And there's a lot of perfectly reasonable reasons to do that. You want to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest, but certainly there are costs associated with leaning on third parties for that kind of service. So we did see that a large majority of companies are really focusing on making that an in-house process.
Okay, terrific. All right, well, let's dive in, Jacob.
Cool. So diving into to really the tiering part of this equation first, I'll start by outlining in broad strokes really two of the major approaches that we see for tiering HCPs. Now, just a moment though, for the purposes of this presentation, we're actually going to be focusing on tiering specialists and on markets in the US and Europe. I'll talk a little bit later about how tiering is different for those other roles and in other parts of the world. So kind of sticking with the sports analogy that we've embraced for today's presentation, we have what I call threshold tiering. And this is where companies set up minimum qualifications for each tier, almost like qualifying times, and then compare HCPs against these thresholds. So on the other hand, we see a lot of companies, especially recently, using a scorecard approach. And this is almost like judging an Olympic event using scores on multiple independent criteria. So as an example of the threshold tiering approach, the table on this slide shows a list of potential qualifications, such as years of experience, number of publications, clinical trials, over on the left-hand side, with columns containing minimum thresholds or ranges for each tier. Now, as you can see, this is a nice quick summary of what qualifies for each tier, and it also makes it relatively easy to set up. But what happens when you have an HCP that meets some but not all of the criteria for a given tier? In this case, many users might just pick whichever tier the HCP qualifies with the most criteria. But really, any time you're introducing ambiguity into these kinds of processes, it really should be avoided. So I want to spend a little bit more time looking at the scorecard approach up next. So the score sheet that you see here, it borrows most of the same tiering criteria from the threshold approach, but instead of simply listing minimum qualifying criteria, the table actually shows point assignments for where HCPs might fall within this range. And those of you who may use a score sheet approach might see some familiar features in this. And then at the bottom, you have a final scoring section that allows users to generate a clear result based on the score sheet. And so you get a nice unambiguous tier segmentation regardless of the HCP's specific qualifications. So, for example, an HCP with 8 years of clinical experience, 8 publications and 5 trials, but maybe they don't have any seniority positions at their institution, that individual would earn a total of 11 points, and we get a clear result that this HCP should be in Tier 1, and that's despite the fact that their qualifications are maybe a little bit, they don't fit a perfect mold, but the scorecard still gives us a very clearly interpretable result. Now, obviously the downside to developing a score sheet like this is that companies need to spend a significant amount of time and effort in actually putting this all together. So obviously the score sheet shown here is simplified for the purposes of illustration. Usually companies are going to be using between 8 to 10 specific criteria when assessing HCP tiering. To sort of demonstrate what the process of developing a full score sheet might look like, we have a list of the typical criteria that might be assessed. Many companies are going to look at speaking experience in addition to the number of clinical trials and publications. And for these criteria, companies are often not only interested in the volume, but the specifics of the event or study. And of particular interest is when the research or speech might align directly with the purpose of the contract. And so effectively what you're doing there is trying to measure quality over quantity. And of course, the primary means of assessing HCP tiering has historically been years of experience, but we actually will discuss a little bit later that this isn't as much of a determining factor as it used to be. Okay, so for the purposes of our example here, let's assume we selected experience, the type of facility at which the HCP works, and then some of their more hands-on experience with the medical science. So in this example, you've identified the relevant criteria, and once you've done that, you can assign weights to them as shown in the slide here. So in this case, we've set experience as the most important criteria, but also relatively high importance for the type of facility, along with comparatively lower weights for speaking and publication experience. And then the scorecard can be built by kind of applying the general ranges that you see here and then dividing them up into categories that are worth points up to the weight you've assigned to the criteria. You can see how that plays out in the original scorecard example that we showed earlier. Now, one thing to note, and I might repeat this a couple times throughout today's presentation, when you're selecting these criteria, you'll always want to make sure that your considerations are scientific and focused on the goals of the contract. Commercial considerations should never be part of the tiering criteria. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of this section, our initial focus was on developing tiering systems specifically for specialists and MDs. The reason for this is that if you're trying to tier allied health professionals and patients or caregivers using the same system, you're not really going to get useful results. So, for example, none of these groups can be reliably segmented by their peer-reviewed publication, stats, or clinical trial publication, or clinical trial participation, rather. So, as a result, companies need to be open to adopting a separate system for these groups. Now, certainly the overall approach can stay the same or be simplified, but at the very least, the criteria may need some adjustment to ensure successful tiering. But now that I've said that, what kinds of criteria should be considered for these other groups? So, to give you a start, for allied health professionals, in addition to the clinical experience, you might consider the volume of procedures that they do or what experience they may have with specific products. And then for patients, speaking experience might still be relevant, plus their current relationship to the disease state. Are they currently undergoing treatment? Are they a previous consumer of your product? That kind of data. So as you can see, there is going to be some overlap between these criteria and the ones that we were looking at for MDs. You don't need to reinvent the wheel here, but again, you do need to make sure that the criteria fit the individual and the needs of the engagement, and of course, make sure that commercial considerations are not a part of the process.
All right, thanks, Jacob. I'm going to jump back in here and introduce our second poll question. And what we're looking at here, what we're curious about is how satisfied you are with your current approach to tiering allied health professionals and patients. And you see 5 options down there, plus 1 if you don't tier these individuals, or maybe this question is simply not applicable to you. All right, so we'll let some of the responses come in here. The actual distribution of answers, which is pretty interesting. Jacob, are you seeing anything there?
Well, I'll start off by saying I do love a good normal distribution. But with that being said, I think what you're seeing here is to a certain degree the uncertainty that still surrounds this. So you do see, if I could do some quick math, you're looking at over a third of respondents who are not at all or barely satisfied with their tiering, for these individuals, and that's just because this is a relatively new process, and with new processes always comes uncertainty. Now, for those of you who are very satisfied or extremely satisfied, feel free to chime in the Q&A panel. I might be interested to hear from you maybe what you think has made your approach particularly successful. But of course, that's entirely optional. Our job here today is to provide you with information.
Okay. Let's move into our second section here. We have a sense of approaches to tiering, but what's changing out there? What are the emerging trends that we're observing? So in this section, I'm asking Jacob to cover, what are the criteria that are actually changing? Which tiers are getting the most attention? Are there geographic differences we should be watching? And is there anything else that we should be aware of or paying attention to?
Sure. So I'll do my best on that. So in the previous slides, we talked mainly about criteria that fall on a spectrum, like the number of publications, years of experience. But I also wanted to look at how commonly used some other more binary criteria are used. And so the billiard balls you see here kind of show the percentage of companies rating a specific tiering criterion as significantly important in their segmentation processes. So here we see more evidence for companies considering the type of institution at which an HCP practices. And I talked about that a little bit on one of the previous slides, where really companies are interested in, is the focus of an institute on the research? Is it a top-level clinical institute? So you're talking about kind of differentiating between maybe a regional healthcare system and maybe a Sloan Kettering of the world. So we also see that in addition to the type of healthcare institute, positions of seniority are also important. But I also do want to highlight the 8-ball in this at the bottom. Currently, just 36% of surveyed companies report formulary setting experience as significantly important to their tiering. I would actually expect this number to shift, or actually to grow based on the current changes in the industry and what we're hearing from clients as they respond to price sensitivity in the market. Another one of the big picture trends we've seen in tiering is a slight decrease in the typical number of years of experience, and specifically here clinical experience, that an HCP has at the highest tier levels. So one view might be that this is purely a vehicle for offering higher compensation amounts to HCPs. But I'm actually going to take a different perspective, which is that this is representative of a more comprehensive tiering landscape that appropriately considers a wider range of factors. So we see companies do this more as they adopt a scorecard approach. We saw an example earlier about how the scorecard approach allows companies to make clear, unambiguous decisions even when an HCP may not meet what was previously considered a minimum threshold in a given category. So I mentioned earlier that the bulk of this presentation is focused on the US and Europe. And the main reason for this is that this is where we have the most visibility into these systems and also where they appear to be the most developed. Now, what I can say about other emerging markets, specifically Latin America and the Asia Pacific region, indicates that some of the thresholds might be lower. And when I'm talking about thresholds, I'm specifically referring to the years of clinical experience required to meet a certain tier, as well as the specialized certifications that some teams in European and American markets might be used to looking for. So with all of that being said, it's really important for those of you in centralized teams, especially at the global level, to make sure that you're working with teams on the ground in each of these markets to make sure that your tiering structure is actually aligned with the marketplace of HCPs with whom you might be engaging. So one last bit on tiering. The data that we show here actually highlights tier utilization over time from when we started to collect data in 2015. And so by tier utilization, what I mean is the percentage of engagements with each tier of HCP over the course of a year. So the data here, like in the rest of this presentation, it does assume a 4-tier structure. That's what CEI publishes. And so that ranges from local, low-level influencers in Tier 3, all the way up through national-level HCPs at Tier 1, and then international or global HCPs at the very top of the heap. Now, as you can see, there aren't really any major shifts in the time frame for me to highlight. We do see the international tier utilization has fallen slightly, and that's really as companies turn to more regional Tier 2 HCPs. And of course, Tier 2s have appeared to retain their status as the most commonly engaged group of HCPs.
Great, thanks, Jacob. All right, that's through 2 sections. We've talked about tiering methodologies, we've talked about some of these trends we're seeing. Now, in our final section, we'll look at a topic that frankly creates no end of questions among our clients, which is exceptions and exceptions processes. So how do exceptions processes work? Who's involved? What are the criteria that organizations are looking at? What other considerations come into play when we're looking at exceptional HCPs and non-HCPs?
All right, thanks, Eric. So to set up our conversation on exceptions, let's first take a look at what percentage of companies have a written process in place for these exceptions. So while we see in this graphic that 60% of companies have a written process, some of the remaining 40% still allow exceptions. And it appears that that just kind of happens on an ad hoc basis. And obviously that's a bit suboptimal when you're talking about a complex process like this one. So hopefully in the rest of this section, we can offer useful insight for companies in that latter situation. So when we look at the percentage of HCPs being sent through exceptions processes, I actually found the data quite interesting because I won't talk about an average today because that doesn't really tell the full story. In one camp, so to speak, 44% of companies send less than 2% of HCPs through an exceptions process. And then on the other hand, 41% of companies send 5 to 10% of their HCPs through an exceptions process to determine their compensation. So I will say that the ceiling for exceptions processing percentage does appear to be around 10 to 12%. So we see this in the data, and there also seems to be a fundamentally practical reason for this. Beyond that level of processing exceptions, the whole process really loses credibility, and you effectively ended up with a tier in and of itself. So if you find yourself in this position, it's probably time to review the process that you have in place and make sure that you're trying to find a solution.
Thanks, Jacob. Okay, this is the third and final poll, I promise, for the webinar today. Here, we're curious about what your typical timeline is for approving and rejecting exceptions. We know this can be a pain point for a lot of organizations. So there are several options there. Again, there's a not applicable option as well. And we'll wait a minute and let some of these answers come in. Numbers are settling down a little bit. A lot of emphasis on 3 to 5 business days. Jacob, what do you think of that?
So it does seem like the turnaround time is for around 60% of folks, certainly less than a week if you count the 1 to 2 week time frame. You're looking at a pretty large portion of the industry that looks to have this turnaround time within 2 weeks, and certainly it seems like within some structures that timeline's as short as a business day or two. We'll talk a little bit about what goes into that decision making, and certainly to an extent how you design the process that we're talking about is going to have a pretty big impact on what a realistic turnaround time looks like. And so I'll try not to read too much into the specifics of that result, but it's certainly interesting to see how many are able to consistently turn things around in under a week.
Yeah, it's pretty quick.
So kind of now that we've seen how long the process can take, and we'll talk a little bit about the details of that process in a moment, the next few slides show who manages that process. So just kind of at a very high level, we do see that 46% of groups, there's just one single stakeholder who can approve exceptions. And then on the other hand, 54% of groups report having multiple stakeholders involved in either approving or denying exceptions processes or exceptions requests. And as for who these stakeholders are and what teams they represent, this slide actually shows the percentage of companies reporting that a given individual or group is responsible for approving exceptions. Now, note that since some companies do have multiple stakeholders or approvers, as we talked about in the previous slide, these numbers will actually add up to more than 100%. You can also see that reliance on these dedicated committees is actually quite small, and that the majority of companies turn to senior members of medical affairs and or compliance to make a final decision on these exceptions. And this is an excellent way to ensure that commercial considerations, and I apologize for sounding like a broken record, but just to make sure that those commercial considerations are not playing an oversized role in the HCP compensation. So now that we know who makes the decision, what should get sent back to the requester? Now, the data that we collected shows that 24% of companies offer just a simple approval or rejection notice. 76% of the groups we surveyed include a specific reasoning for why the request was approved or rejected. And this is actually highly encouraging to see within the industry. And it also acts as effective ongoing education for the entire organization that these groups operate in. By going the additional step of providing the requester details on why an exception was or wasn't granted, the approval stakeholders are continuously providing feedback on what constitutes appropriate usage of the exceptions process, and obviously that's a good long-term goal to have. I mentioned earlier kind of that what goes into a request will have an impact on the actual timeline, and so this slide I'll look at what might be important in these types of requests and how should approval stakeholders view various potential justifications for an exception. In the survey we ran, we asked respondents to indicate the importance of exceptions criteria on a 1 to 5 scale, with 5 being the most important criterion. Now, again, it's actually super encouraging to see the industry focusing on the specifics of the HCP's experience and, importantly, what makes them unique. Another highly important factor, it scored 3.7 out of 5 in our survey, is the justification of the need for that HCP at the specific event or for the specific contract that you are proposing the exception. Now, at the lower end, we see requests for specific compensation amounts and also details on the HCP's current relationship with the company. And really, those are not important from a medical or scientific consideration and shouldn't really be a part of the deliberations. So I know we've gone a little bit into some of the details in the slides above, but I'm actually going to, before we wrap up, take a step back and talk about 3 core compliance principles that are really going to be the key underpinnings of any successful tiering and or exceptions process you put in place. This is going to be pretty broadly applicable. So I can't take credit for the set of three that you see up here. I've seen it around the industry for several years, but I do like how it frames the issue, which is that you want to make sure that your policies are rational, well documented, and consistently applied. And the first key is simple, right? You want a process. If you want that process to be adapted within your organization, it needs to be rational in the sense that it's easy to understand. And potentially more importantly, if you're ever going to withstand regulatory scrutiny, you need to ensure that what you're doing is rational and also that any assumptions or decisions you're making have been well documented, which naturally leads us to the second point. Not only do underlying assumptions need to be thoroughly documented, but the process as itself, from soup to nuts, needs to be well defined and carefully described. And then this documentation shouldn't just sit in a folder on the internet. It needs to be distributed and easily accessible for any relevant parts of your organization. And then if a process is well documented, then that just makes it so much easier to be consistently applied. And that's really what this is all about, right? The best process in the world in a vacuum doesn't actually help you accomplish your goals from a medical, scientific, or compliance perspective. So you want to make sure that whatever process you put in place is consistently applied every time. Now, this might mean for certain initiatives that it involves more hands-on training or outreach that may not be the historical norm within your organization, but it might also be entirely necessary. So naturally, I'll end on a reminder that's kind of a key part of any discussion that overlaps between commercial teams and compliance or medical/scientific affairs. Just make sure that the process that you're using for exceptions is being driven by medical and scientific considerations, not commercial incentives, not by a need to engage with a single or specific HCP. And if you'll forgive a final use of the sporting metaphor, our little referee on the side is a nice reminder that having a rational written process in place that an informed decision maker can consistently follow will actually help you ensure that you don't cross any of these lines. Eric?
Terrific. Thank you, Jacob. Okay, that brings us to the end of our slides for the day. We're going to get into some Q&A now. There have been questions coming in. I would encourage all of you to use that Q&A pane at the bottom. If you do have any questions, we're going to try to get to as many of these as we possibly can. But don't hold back if there's anything you're curious about, or if you take issue with anything that we shared today. Please let us know down there, and we will follow up with you. All right, so I'm going to start throwing some of these questions at Jacob. The first question, Jacob, is, and you touched on this a little bit in the slide that had the world map in it, but how does tiering change in emerging markets or in less developed markets?
So the big difference that we see there is really that because the HCP population might be somewhat smaller, or you're just dealing with different educational systems, you're going to want to make sure that, first of all, your criteria are relevant to the HCP pathway that that physicians will go through in that specific market. And then in addition, you want to make sure that you have scaled appropriately, so that way you have a good distribution of HCPs within these tiers that actually reflects the concentration of useful knowledge within those individuals.
Okay, terrific. Here's another one. Okay, what is the ceiling for an exceptional rate? And I guess what this is getting at is there an amount you should go up to that you shouldn't surpass? Is there some sort of cap on what we should be paying in the exceptions processes?
So this is one that we've gotten a couple of variations of from clients, and it's hard to answer because I don't know if there's necessarily a specific ceiling that you can put in place. we have our Nobel laureate Wheaties on a couple of these slides, and that kind of highlights a case in which if you are hoping to engage with a literal Nobel laureate who has significant experience within his field, you are now outside of the realm of what traditional fair market value might encompass. And so it's really about making sure that when you process the exceptions request for that individual, that you're following the process that you've outlined. Hopefully it's well defined and consistently followed, so that way you have a justification for whatever rate you end up approving.
Okay. Well, here's a question, and actually it speaks to that very first poll question that we had, and there are a couple of questions that seem to be getting at this topic. But in a nutshell, the question is, who should be tiering? Is there an appropriate way to do this? Is there an industry standard way to do this? Should it be internal? Should it be a third party? So there are different questions asking these kinds of questions. But basically, in our minds, who should be doing the tiering?
You know, it's interesting. We saw in the poll results, there is certainly room, especially for small companies, to lean on third-party experts to really inform their decision, and that definitely makes sense. And this is also applicable to the first question we got, which is around the regions. So third parties could be particularly helpful to leverage when you are talking about understanding a healthcare environment that may be significantly different from the one in which you have historically operated. And so third parties can be extremely useful in at least helping you set those guidelines.
Right. Okay. So here's another question, and this is specifically about patients. So we're getting into those allied health professionals and patients, which is on the fair market value payment side, certainly an area where we're seeing a lot more activity. People are curious about how these individuals are being compensated. And the question is, and I'm going to reframe it, but the question is, what's the typical range of rates paid to patients? And I know that can be a complicated question. So Jacob, I'm going to ask you, can you speak to how patients are compensated, maybe how patients are tiered as a part of this process? How do organizations approach that?
Sure. So the interesting thing about tiering patients is that you are going to be interested in what they are currently doing with regards to their relationship with your company. In terms of like the actual rates being paid to them, the structure of these payments has actually gone through some changes over time. You know, typically when you're talking about engaging with an HCP, you're looking at some kind of hourly or event-based payment. But in contrast to that, the types of activities that patients are being asked to do might be a little more informal. You might be looking at blog posts. And so the structure has to change a little bit. And to be transparent, we haven't got a lot of data on how to successfully interpret that. What I can say, though, is that anytime you're dealing with a patient, you want to make sure that the amount that you're paying them has some relation to the household earning in the market that you're talking about.
Okay.
Because even if that patient might be an extremely high earner, you are not paying them for their earnings outside of being a patient. You are paying them or compensating for their time as it relates to their experience as a patient. And so while it might be tempting to bring in extraneous details like, oh, well, we need to pay this patient higher because he makes more outside of being a patient, it's not really something that's relevant to patient compensation.
Okay. Yeah, and I would be remiss if I don't jump in and say that one of the titles, if you want to call it that, one of the categories that we provide hourly FMV rates for is patients. So we get into that side of things. And so that is going to differ market to market, as Jacob has pointed out. Okay. Here's an interesting question. The basic question is, how do you weight clinical volume, or how does time in the clinic come into the tiering process. And in this particular question, our audience member is pointing out that there are a lot of top-tier thought leaders who are no longer seeing patients in the clinic, whereas others may still have regular clinic hours and so on. So that you can reach a diverging point there in terms of the volume of hours in the clinic.
And that's absolutely true of where the market is going, particularly in the U.S., where you see allied health professionals really stepping into that role as almost a primary care provider. And so what I have seen is that maybe for specialists, the clinical volume is no longer as important from a tiering perspective, but if you are tiering these allied health professionals like nurse practitioners and these physician assistants, that might be where clinical volume is a more relevant tiering consideration.
Okay, thanks. Here's a question on the scorecard approach. And what the questioner is asking, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is basically how do you set those different scores? So how do you set the thresholds for your different scores? What makes a tier 1 a tier 1? What makes a tier 3 a tier 3?
So the way that I have seen companies do it and the way that I did it in my very simplified example here today was really just kind of play through a couple of scenarios where, okay, I know that I have an individual that meets that falls into the following categories, and in my current system, he is a tier 2. And you can almost use that to sanity check the scorecard approach. Does the scorecard kind of still follow the existing system?
Okay, terrific. Okay, thanks. And so it sounds like it's going to be case by case.
It is, and that's part of what makes the scorecard approach a little bit more involved up front, because it's much more than simply setting the thresholds and then putting them out there. You actually will have to do a little bit of testing, and you'll need to make sure that that you're yielding results that are in line with what you've done historically, but are also going to make sense going forward.
Okay, terrific. Great, thanks. Okay, I'm going to start wrapping things up here. If you do have more questions, I know they're still coming in, please use that Q&A pane. There's contact information up here on the screen. You can certainly use that to reach out to either one of us or both of us if you have any questions. I know a lot of you have relationships with your account managers here at CEI, so feel free to follow up with us. We'll also be at some of these upcoming conferences, so if you're going to be at any of these events, please swing by and say hello to us. We'd love to talk with you. Now, before I let you go completely, I'm going to ask you to please fill out the super easy evaluation that's going to pop up after the webinar. It's really short and really easy, and I'm being sincere when I say that we really value your feedback, and we actually derive a lot of direction from it. And with that said, I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate the opportunity to work with you and speak with you, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.